From the decaying ruins of the most haunted prison in America to an old Chinese fishing village being destroyed by nature, here are 10 of the most amazing abandoned places. Fort Alexander. There are some pretty fantastic abandoned places out there to explore. One particularly amazing location is in Russia at a man-made island fort that has been used throughout the years to house soldiers, to assist scientists, and to let raving teenagers have a blast. It's located in the Baltic Sea and it's named Fort Alexander. It was once used to protect the shore from invading forces after it was originally constructed in the mid-1800s. The island had to be built as well as the fort. Everything was made from scratch. The island was actually set on a series of beams that were driven into the seafloor, and all these years later it still stands. Fort Alexander has a main building, a central courtyard, and the capability of housing at least 1,000 soldiers over 3 floors. Because cannons were popular in the 1800s, it also has enough room for over 100 cannons and gun fortifications. However, even though this place was so fortified, it never actually saw any military combat. It was in too strategic of a location and nobody was stupid enough to invade the area. Roughly 100 years after it was built, the base was transformed into a plague research facility in the early 1900s. Russian scientists studied cholera, tetanus, and the bubonic plague using horses and other animals as test subjects. The fort was abandoned in the 1980s, it became a site for urban explorers, and then it became a very popular place to host illegal raves. Fort Alexander has stood through the centuries as a base for war, a research facility for the Black Death, and then a place for young people to go in order to have a party. Who knows what this fort will become in the next 30 years. San Juan Parangaricutiro. San Juan Parangaricutiro is an abandoned town with its only surviving church based in lava. At least that's exactly what it looks like. This place is located in the state of Michoacán, Mexico. The church is the only remaining structure left from the village of San Juan Parangaricutiro. Way back in February of 1943, a volcano erupted, but it erupted very slowly. Over the course of about a year, this volcano gradually consumed 2 villages in lava and ash. It took over 365 days for the slowly flowing lava to reach this church and melt the rocks around it. The entire town was wiped out. Everyone was forced to leave in an evacuation, but the church still stood strong, and it stands strong this day. In fact, there is now an annual pilgrimage to the church by worshippers who are convinced that God stepped in to save it from the volcano while the rest of the town was destroyed. Even more incredible is that the local Paracutan volcano, which destroyed the 2 villages, continued to erupt for 8 full years. It was not that dramatic, so you probably wouldn't have heard about it, and it's not that famous because nobody died from the eruption. But it did erupt for nearly a full decade, wiping out 2 towns and hundreds of homes. But the church stood undestroyed through it all. You can now find it frozen in the middle of a sea of volcanic rock, with its tower and its main altar completely untouched. The flooded bell tower of Kalyazin. The small Russian town of Kalyazin only has a population of around 13,000 people. It's located just 120 miles from Moscow on the bank of the Volga River. But it's not the town itself that is the subject of the story, it's their flooded bell tower. Between 1939 and 1940, part of the old town, including the main historical district and all the historical architectural monuments, were flooded during the construction of a hydroelectric power station. The old part of the town had to be abandoned so that the station could be built, but all that water couldn't wipe away the bell tower. It's the only thing that miraculously survived the flooding, and it still stands today as an incredible monument and tourist attraction. The bell tower belongs to the St. Nicholas Cathedral, which was built in the year 1800. The height of the bell tower, which now looks eerily like a lighthouse in the middle of a lake, is approximately 243 feet. It's impossible to reach the bell tower unless you have a little boat, but it's still a very interesting spot to go for watching the sunset or the sunrise. If you go at just the right time, you can see the sun rising through the center of the tower. This is definitely one of the most amazing abandoned places you can visit. Have you ever explored an abandoned place without permission? Did you trespass on a condemned building? Perhaps find an old rusted out playground in the woods? Or maybe you found a hideout along an old drainage ditch or some overgrown train tracks? Let me know about your coolest encounter with an abandoned place in the comments below, then be sure to subscribe to Talltanic by clicking that big red button if you haven't already for more amazing videos. The Eastern State Penitentiary. The Eastern State Penitentiary is not quite as amazing as it is horrifying. This was a radical prison from the 19th century designed to create social change, and today it is an abandoned horror house that you wouldn't want your worst enemy to stay in overnight. This place originally opened in 1829, and it was grand. It was built as an experiment to reform criminals through isolation. This revolutionary penitentiary became the model for prison design all across the world. At the time, it was the most expensive construction project in the United States of America. According to the Philadelphia Tourism Department, the Eastern State Penitentiary closed its doors as a prison after 142 years of use back in 1971. Since then, it has been named a National Historic Landmark. But there is a particularly haunting part. As a prison that operated for almost 150 years, you can imagine the types of violent and nightmarish things that went on inside the building. There were definitely murders, there may have been some torture, and there was certainly at least a little bit of death. Some of the most famous prisoners at the penitentiary include the famous bank robber Slick Willie and Al Capone. There have been plenty of tales of ghosts living inside the walls of the prison, and today you can take a special tour through the penitentiary at night, but only if you're brave enough to face the possible paranormal activity within. Battleship Island. Battleship Island is one of the most gorgeous abandoned places in all of Japan. You might remember Battleship Island without even knowing it. It was recently the location of the James Bond villain's evil lair in the movie Skyfall, but the island is far more ominous in real life. From between about 1880 and 1974, it was a tiny island off the coast of Japan that operated as a coal mine with tunnels that stretched around 2,000 feet under the main structures. The city on Battleship Island was built by the Mitsubishi Corporation to house the miners and their families. The island was basically a self-enclosed civilization with a school, a hospital, shrines, and plenty of apartment towers. But it was abandoned abruptly in 1974. This happened because the coal ran out. The Mitsubishi Corporation closed the mine, the island was evacuated pretty much overnight, and since then it has remained a ghost town with its buildings crumbling into rubble. This is a sad story for the island, especially since back in the 1950s it was considered the most densely populated place on Earth, with roughly 5,000 residents living in prosperity. Now, there's nothing left but their memories. In 2015, UNESCO designated Battleship Island as a World Heritage Site, and now if you're special enough, you can get a unique permit to visit the island as a tourist. Monsal Forts. The Monsal Forts are a group of old and abandoned navy towers from the war era. They're located miles off the coast of England, and you can only reach them by boat. The forts were once used to guard the United Kingdom against bombs, but today they are in decline, abandoned, and gradually falling into the ocean. Because the country needed to protect itself from German bombers back in the 1940s, the answer was to build special forts out at sea so that foreign planes and boats could be annihilated before ever reaching the coastline. 3 such forts were installed in the ocean back in 1942, and they were named Nor, Red Sands, and Shivering Sands. Today there are only 2 left remaining. Each tower stood on 4 concrete legs, and inside would be about 265 men. They were assigned to live in the forts, in the cold and isolation for as long as it took to defend the country. And believe it or not, these weird-looking forts proved successful in blocking German threats. A report from Insider claims that during operations, the forts shot down at least 22 planes and stopped 30 bombs. But of course, these forts were eventually abandoned. In the 1950s, the soldiers left, and in the 1960s, some radio operators moved in and used them as pirate radio stations. However, that didn't last long, and today the forts are completely empty. Nobody can live on them any longer, as it's way too cold and they're basically decaying death traps anyway. Rumu Underwater Prison. The Rumu underwater prison is located in modern-day Estonia. It was once a Soviet prison built inside of a quarry, and no, it was not always underwater. The prison was used in the 1940s by the Soviet Union as a place where prisoners went and were forced to work 12 hours a day every day of the week. The Soviets preferred to use this prison because it was inside a limestone quarry, and it allowed them to use their prison workforce to do all the backbreaking labor that others didn't feel like doing. But when the Soviet Union collapsed and Estonia regained her independence in 1991, the old guards moved out and left the prison empty. The prison and the quarry were both abandoned during the shift, and the whole place was mostly forgotten. It fell into ruin, most of it fell into the water that filled up the quarry, and today it's a popular diving spot. This is one of the most amazing abandoned places you can visit right now, as it's wildly popular with beachgoers and adventurous tourists. You can now dive beneath the ruins of the old Soviet prison, but not only that, you can go snorkeling, paddleboarding, and you can even canoe around the decaying, half-sunken structure. This is an experience that you simply cannot get anywhere else. house. Guji Island. Guji Island in China looks like a town out of a fairy tale. It's an abandoned village off the eastern coast of China, and it's made a name for itself lately as an unusual travel destination. The town's name is Hutuan, and it was once a prosperous fishing village. In the 1980s, it boasted a population of about 3,000 residents, but because the village was in such a remote location, its residents began to move out in the 1990s, probably drawn by the allure of the big cities. In 2002, the village was officially depopulated and 100% abandoned, but after decades of being without people, the empty houses of the village have since been taken over by nature. Pictures of the ghost village began to circulate and tourists started surging in the region. This became a big problem for local officials as the tiny area was not equipped to deal with tourists. But they have since embraced the popularity. A viewing platform opened in 2017, and for a small fee you can hike around the village and check out the fairy tale houses. Just be careful, as there could be wild animals and spiders that are as big as your face. The Berlin Ghost Town. Next on the list is a town named Berlin. I'm not talking about the city of Berlin in Germany. This is a ghost town in the state of Nevada. And unlike most ghost towns in the Old West, which have been left to wither and decay, Berlin has actually been preserved by the state. That means you can go check out this abandoned ghost town and see exactly what it was actually like to have lived back in the days of the gold rush. The park was established in 1957, but the town itself was established in 1897 as part of the Union Mining District. It was named Berlin because most of the miners who lived there hailed from Germany. The town never really prospered like other boom towns in the area, and after the Panic of 1907, the town began to decline. By 1911, it was entirely abandoned. The town then sat there rotting until the state took it over in the 50s, and now the town is a perfectly preserved historical record of the late 1800s. But be warned, it's one spooky place to visit after dark. Podium Castle. Podium Castle is one of hundreds of castles located all throughout the United Kingdom, and it has a pretty cool history. First of all, nobody in the United States can understand the grandeur of the European castles without seeing one firsthand. They are simply awesome, and it is a true shame that there are no ancient castles in North America. But Podium Castle was built in 1385. It has since become one of the most beloved castles in all of England. It has an iconic moat, it's surrounded by beautiful green scenery, and the building itself is ridiculously well preserved. The castle was originally built by a knight of Edward III, and it was designed with the intention of defending the area of East Sussex, probably from the French during the 100 Years' War. It was built not only to protect the people of the area and the family inside, but it was also built to be an exceptionally comfortable and modern home. The castle was also constructed all at once, meaning that the entire style of the building is the same. This is not something you see in most castles of that same era, as most of them were built throughout the course of a few hundred years. But here's where things get confusing. The castle belonged to a family, and then the family line went extinct because there was nobody left to carry on their name. The castle changed hands to a different family. It was then taken away during the War of Roses, eventually returned, and then under stable ownership until the 16th century. But then during the English Civil War back in 1641, the castle was sold to pay for somebody's fines. The castle was bought and dismantled, and it was eventually left as a ruin and abandoned. The castle was again purchased in 1829, but nobody really did anything with it until 1925 when it was given over to the National Trust and then opened to the public. It's truly a remarkable piece of history, and it still stands strong today. Which one of these abandoned places would you love to visit one day? Let me know how you feel in the comments section. If you haven't already, don't forget to subscribe. See you again soon for another awesome video, and thanks so much for watching.